There is a specific number that should be making much bigger news than it currently is. In the year 2023, the share of global central bank reserves held in United States dollars fell below 58%. This marks the lowest figure recorded since the Bretton Woods system officially established the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency back in 1944. Nearly 8 decades of uncontested monetary dominance have passed, and a critical threshold has been crossed that most financial analysts had confidently predicted would take at least another generation to reach. Here is what that specific number does not actually tell you. The dollar did not weaken because the American economy collapsed. The United States economy remains, by most conventional and objective measures, the largest and most productive economy in the entire world. American companies still absolutely dominate the global sectors of technology, finance, and defense. The S&P 500 still sets the emotional temperature of financial markets from London to Seoul. The dollar is still utilized in roughly 88% of all international currency transactions. By every single traditional metric of monetary power, the United States dollar looks completely untouchable. Yet central banks all around the world are quietly, deliberately, and systematically reducing their financial exposure to it. They are not doing this because they have suddenly found a better currency. They are not doing it because the euro has suddenly become more attractive or because the Chinese yuan is somehow ready to replace the dollar tomorrow. They are reducing their exposure for a reason that is far more consequential than any of those simple explanations, and a reason that is far more difficult to reverse. They are reducing their exposure because they are afraid. This is not fundamentally about China. This is about America. What changed was not the dollar's underlying economic fundamentals. What changed was a specific series of decisions made in Washington over the past 2 decades that gradually transformed the dollar from a neutral global public good into a direct instrument of American foreign policy. The moment that transformation became completely undeniable, the exact moment every finance minister and central bank governor on earth had to confront it directly, was in February of 2022. That was when the United States and its allied nations froze approximately $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves held within Western financial institutions. Think carefully about what that specific decision actually meant in practice. Russia is a G20 economy. Its central bank held dollar and euro reserves strictly according to the established rules of the international financial system. These were the exact same rules that every other central bank in the world follows. And yet, in a single weekend, those reserves were rendered completely inaccessible. They were not seized through a formal, transparent court process. They were not frozen after a legitimate criminal conviction. They were immobilized by a sheer executive decision made in direct response to a geopolitical conflict. The message received in every single finance ministry that following Monday morning was not complicated at all. It was this: your reserves are not truly your reserves. They are merely assets held entirely at the discretion of Washington. And if your government ever finds itself on the wrong side of an American foreign policy decision, those assets can completely disappear before the markets even open. That stark realization did not create the underlying crisis of confidence in American hegemony, but it absolutely crystallized it. It turned an abstract theoretical concern into a concrete operational risk, the exact kind of risk that central banks are legally and institutionally required to manage. And the world began managing it immediately. Within just 18 months of the Russian reserve freeze, bilateral currency swap agreements designed to bypass the dollar had expanded to cover economies representing nearly a third of the entire global GDP. Saudi Arabia opened formal discussions about pricing a portion of its vital oil exports in Chinese yuan, a conversation that would have been considered geopolitically unthinkable just 5 years earlier. India settled its very first rupee-denominated oil trade directly with Russia. Brazil and China signed a direct currency agreement, entirely eliminating dollar intermediation from their bilateral trade. And inside the European Union, quiet, serious conversations began about reducing euro-dollar interdependence in ways that would have been considered a severe anti-American provocation only a decade ago. None of this happened because these countries suddenly became hostile to the United States. Most of them still maintain formal alliance relationships or deep intertwined economic partnerships with Washington. What happened is something far more subtle and far more structurally significant. They made a highly rational calculation that dependence on a single hegemon, however powerful that hegemon may be, now carries a category of political risk that their institutions simply cannot responsibly ignore. That specific calculation is the true engine of the most important geopolitical realignment of our lifetime. This is not a military confrontation. It is not a technological competition, though that is certainly real. It is not even a conventional great power rivalry, though that too is actively reshaping the international system. The deepest, most profound shift is happening quietly, inside reserve accounts, within currency swap agreements, and in the quiet architectural decisions of finance ministries that never make the front page of any newspaper. By the end of this documentary, you will understand exactly why that shift is structural rather than cyclical. You will understand why no single election, no policy reversal, and no diplomatic reset can simply undo what has already been set in motion. You will understand the specific sequence of decisions that made this outcome not just possible, but in retrospect, almost entirely inevitable. And you will understand what a world looks like when American power remains formidable, but American hegemony has already ended. Because that world is not a future scenario. It is the world we are already living in right now. Most people, when they think about American hegemony, immediately think about aircraft carriers. The United States currently operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups, which is more than the rest of the world combined. It maintains active military bases or significant force deployments in over 80 different countries. Its defense budget easily exceeds the combined military spending of the next 10 nations. By any measure of raw coercive capacity, the United States military is without historical precedent in the modern era. But here is the fundamental problem with that picture. Military power explains how hegemony is enforced. It does not explain how hegemony actually functions. And that crucial distinction between enforcement and function is the most important thing to understand about what is actually happening to American global leadership right now. The United States has never been more militarily powerful than it is today, and it has never been less trusted. Those two facts existing simultaneously is not a paradox. It is a precise, accurate description of what hegemonic erosion looks like from the inside. Because legitimate hegemony, the only kind that actually works at a global scale without requiring permanent coercion, is not built on military supremacy alone. It is built on something far more fragile and far more powerful. The broadly shared perception that American leadership produces outcomes that are genuinely better for the international system than any available alternative. The post-1945 American order was deliberately constructed on 4 load-bearing pillars. The first was security, provided through NATO in Europe, bilateral treaty alliances in Asia, and security guarantees across the Middle East. Washington provided military protection that allowed its allies to spend less on defense and more on domestic economic development. This was not pure altruism, but it delivered a genuine public good, a degree of great power stability that, whatever its contradictions, successfully prevented a Third World War. The second pillar was trade. An open international trading system through GATT and later the WTO that created genuine, documented pathways to prosperity for dozens of economies. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and later China itself built absolute economic miracles on the back of reliable access to American markets. The third pillar was institutions: the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations system. These were organizations that gave smaller states a forum, a set of rules, and a dispute resolution process that provided, at the very least, the architecture of meaningful participation. The fourth pillar was the dollar, the reserve currency that provided essential global liquidity without requiring every single bilateral transaction to carry its own complex currency negotiation. and that was critically perceived as genuinely neutral. These four pillars served American interests first, but they served enough other interests for enough countries across enough decades that most of the world accepted U.S. leadership as the least bad available option. Not enthusiastically, not without resentment, but with acceptance nonetheless. This was because the alternative to American hegemony was not obviously better, and the system produced enough stability and enough prosperity to sustain widespread participation. That acceptance, not the aircraft carriers, not the nuclear arsenal, was the true source of American power. It was what allowed Washington to set the rules of the international system and have those rules treated as legitimate. It was what made American hegemony a system rather than simply an empire. Most analysts focus entirely on what is challenging American power. What they completely miss is what is withdrawing consent from it. And those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. Challenging American power requires building a rival military, a rival economy, and a rival technology sector. Withdrawing consent requires something far simpler, concluding that the costs of dependence on American-led institutions now heavily outweigh the benefits. That conclusion, quiet, rational, and spreadsheet level, is what is now spreading across the international system, with a speed and breadth that no military buildup could ever match. The erosion of American hegemony did not begin with Donald Trump, or with China's rise, or with the war in Ukraine. It began in a desert in Iraq in the year 2003. The invasion of Iraq was not the beginning of American decline. In the spring of that year, the United States stood at the absolute apex of its unipolar moment, commanding the most powerful military force in human history and an economy representing nearly a third of global GDP. What the Iraq invasion did was something more specific and more damaging than mere decline. It introduced a question that the post-1945 order had been deliberately designed to make unaskable. Are the rules of this system actually binding on the country that wrote them? The United Nations Security Council did not authorize the invasion. France, Germany, and Russia publicly opposed it. The legal basis was contested by the overwhelming majority of international legal scholars. And yet, the invasion proceeded because Washington made a deliberate judgment that its strategic interests superseded the institutional constraints it had spent 60 years constructing and championing. The world noticed. Not just America's adversaries, its allies noticed, its partners noticed. The governments that had built their entire foreign policies around the assumption that American power operated within a rules-based framework were forced to update that assumption in real time. The rules-based international order, they now understood, was conditional. It applied when convenient, and when American strategic interests demanded otherwise, the rules bent. That was the first credibility rupture, and it could not be undone by subsequent regret, by the eventual acknowledgement that the intelligence was flawed, or by the eventual withdrawal of American forces. The question once asked remained permanently in the system. 5 years later, the second blow arrived, and this time it came from the very institutions Washington had built to manage global economic stability. The 2008 financial crisis originated entirely inside the American financial system, the exact same system the IMF and World Bank had spent decades prescribing to developing economies as the ultimate model of sound economic governance. When the crisis radiated outward, it devastated economies from Iceland to Indonesia that had done absolutely nothing to cause it. Countries that had followed IMF conditionality, maintained sound fiscal balances, and integrated into the dollar-denominated global financial system, found themselves punished for their very integration. The implicit promise of the American economic order had always been, accept our rules, open your markets, hold our currency, and you will be protected by the stability of the system we manage. The 2008 crisis broke that promise with brutal clarity. And the response, massive bailouts of American financial institutions while developing economies absorbed collateral damage without comparable support, made the double standard impossible to ignore. When Britain froze Argentine assets during the Falklands War in 1982, It accelerated the quiet exit from sterling as a reserve currency that had already been underway for a decade. Washington just did the exact same thing, but at 20 times the scale. Then came the third rupture. Different in kind, not just in degree. The post-2001 progressive expansion of dollar-based financial sanctions as a primary instrument of American foreign policy was the deliberate conversion of a neutral, global public good into a targeted coercive tool. This was used against Russia after Crimea, against Iran through SWIFT disconnection, against Venezuela, and against dozens of smaller entities. Each application sent the same compounding message. Access to the dollar system is a privilege extended entirely at Washington's discretion, not a right guaranteed by participation in the international financial system. Then came February 2022, the freezing of $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves, a categorical shift that told every central bank governor on earth something no previous action had so clearly demonstrated. There is no amount of rule following, no degree of institutional participation, and no level of reserve accumulation that places your assets beyond the reach of American political decision-making. Iraq established that American power operated above its own rules. The 2008 crisis established that American-designed institutions could not protect their members from American-generated instability. The sanctions architecture established that American-controlled financial infrastructure was a political weapon available for deployment against any government Washington chose to target. Each rupture compounded the previous one. 3 strikes, 3 irreversible withdrawals of institutional credibility, and the world did not simply take note, it began to build. The conventional wisdom insists that de-dollarization is slower than headlines suggest, that no viable alternative to the dollar exists, that BRICS is too internally divided to matter, and that American alliances remain fundamentally intact. Every single one of those observations contains a grain of truth. Together, however, they produce a conclusion that is dangerously, systematically wrong. The hidden strategic story is not that the world is waiting for a single alternative to replace American hegemony. It is that the world has stopped waiting for any alternative at all, and has begun with quiet urgency and considerable sophistication, engineering its own exit from American dependency. One sector at a time, one bilateral agreement at a time, one institutional bypass at a time. Not a revolution, but an infrastructure project. And infrastructure projects do not announce themselves. They simply gradually become load-bearing. China currently maintains active bilateral currency swap agreements with more than 40 central banks, with a combined value growing from effectively zero in 2008 to over $500 billion by 2023. China's cross-border interbank payment system processed the equivalent of $12 trillion in transactions in 2022, a figure that has roughly doubled every 3 years since its launch. Global central bank gold purchases reached their highest level since 1967 in 2022. Not coincidentally, this was the exact year Russian reserves were frozen. Gold cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be frozen in a foreign jurisdiction. It cannot be rendered inaccessible by executive order. Its renewed attractiveness is a direct, measurable consequence of the weaponization of dollar reserves. The dollar share of global reserves, which stood at 73% as recently as 2001, has now declined to below 58%. This is a 15 percentage point shift, representing trillions of dollars in reallocation, accomplished not by any single dramatic decision, but by the accumulated portfolio adjustments of dozens of central banks independently reaching the exact same professional conclusion. The BRICS New Development Bank has approved loans totaling over $30 billion across its member countries, all denominated in local currencies, bypassing dollar conditionality entirely. Here's the part nobody is talking about. The most aggressive builders of dollar alternatives are not China and Russia. They are countries that still publicly call themselves American allies. And Washington knows it. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that has anchored the petrodollar system since 1974. the arrangement under which oil is priced in dollars, and Saudi revenues are recycled through American financial markets, opened formal negotiations in 2023 about pricing a portion of its oil exports in yuan. If even a fraction of Saudi oil shifts to yuan pricing, the structural demand-sustaining dollar dominance begins eroding at its very foundation in ways that accelerate their own momentum as other producers inevitably follow. Germany and France established the Instex mechanism in 2019 to conduct trade with Iran outside of dollar clearing. Limited in scope and largely unsuccessful in practice, it nonetheless established a vital precedent. European governments would build workarounds to American financial coercion rather than simply comply. That precedent has not been forgotten in subsequent European strategic discussions about financial sovereignty. South Korea, a treaty ally with 28,500 American troops on its territory, a country whose security depends entirely on the American nuclear umbrella, has nonetheless quietly diversified its reserve holdings, increased its gold allocation, and expanded currency swap arrangements with China. Not because Seoul is moving toward Beijing, but because South Korea's financial authorities made a professional determination that concentration risk in dollar assets has increased, and that prudent reserve management requires diversification. This is not a story about American weakness. It is a story about rational self-insurance by governments that once trusted Washington unconditionally and no longer do. Weakness can be corrected with strength. Trust, once broken at an institutional scale, requires something far more difficult to rebuild: a sustained, verifiable, costly demonstration of restraint. Not promises, not declarations. Demonstrated, costly restraint. The willingness to forego coercive tools, even when their use would be strategically advantageous. There is absolutely no evidence that Washington is prepared to make that demonstration. And without it, the alternative architecture being built, imperfect, incomplete, and in many places fragile, will continue to develop. This is because the governments building it have concluded that an imperfect alternative is preferable to unconditional dependence on a hegemon that has shown it will deploy every available tool when it judges its interests to be at stake. Let us be precise about what is actually being claimed here, because precision matters enormously, and the lack of it is responsible for most of the bad analysis currently circulating about American global power. American power is not collapsing. The United States economy will generate approximately $27 trillion in output this year. Its technology sector maintains advantages no rival has come close to replicating. Its capital markets remain the deepest, most liquid, and most sophisticated on Earth. Its military retains capabilities in precision strike, in undersea warfare, in space-based intelligence, and in nuclear deterrence that no combination of rivals can currently match. What is ending is a specific configuration of leadership that allowed Washington to set the rules of the international system and have those rules accepted as legitimate. Not merely tolerated as the imposition of the strongest power, but genuinely accepted as the framework within which most of the world was willing to conduct its affairs. That is hegemony in the precise sense. And it is different from raw power in ways that change everything about how the international system functions. A world where America is powerful but not hegemonic is not a world at peace under Chinese leadership. It is something considerably messier and more dangerous. It is a world where rules are contested rather than settled, where every major decision requires intense negotiation rather than simple imposition, where disputes once managed through institutional channels carry a much higher risk of escalating to direct confrontation. In the security domain, American alliance commitments, once treated as bedrock certainties, are now routinely and publicly questioned by the allies themselves. Gulf states sat out the Ukraine conflict in ways that directly contradicted American preferences, refused to increase oil production when Washington requested it, and opened diplomatic channels with Iran with minimal consultation. France has spent a decade arguing for European strategic autonomy, the capacity to act militarily and diplomatically without American permission. In the financial domain, Dollar dominance and dollar hegemony are diverging for the first time since 1944. Dominance means the dollar is used most. Hegemony means the dollar is used without question, without political calculation, without contingency planning for its potential unavailability. That unquestioning quality is exactly what is ending. In the institutional domain, American-led organizations are not being dismantled, they are being made optional. And optional institutions must compete for participation rather than assume it. In the normative domain, the Western liberal order's claim to universal applicability is now openly rejected by governments representing more than half of humanity. Not because those governments have fought for a coherent alternative philosophy, but because the gap between Washington's stated values and its demonstrated behavior has become too wide to bridge with rhetoric alone. A world without American hegemony is not automatically a more just world. It may be a significantly more dangerous one. The alternative to legitimate hegemony is not justice, it is competition. And great power competition, in the absence of a broadly accepted referee, has a historical tendency to produce outcomes considerably worse for the world's most vulnerable populations than even a hypocritical and self-interested hegemony. For the 54 countries of Africa currently navigating between IMF conditionality, Chinese Belt and Road debt obligations, and American sanctions pressure, the end of clear hegemonic leadership does not produce freedom. It produces a ruthless auction for influence, in which every major power makes its offers conditional on political alignment, and the weakest states bear the highest cost of the resulting competition. Now consider the strongest counter-argument. America has been here before. After Vietnam, after Watergate, after the oil shocks of the 1970s, the conventional wisdom declared American hegemony finished. And then came the Reagan buildup, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the unipolar moment of the 1990s that made the obituaries for American power look faintly ridiculous. Why is this time different? The answer is structural, not cyclical. Those previous credibility crises occurred within a bipolar system where the alternative to American leadership was Soviet leadership, which was sufficiently unattractive that American recovery was the path of least resistance for most actors. The current erosion is occurring in a world where the alternative is not a single rival system, but a distributed set of institutional options. None are as comprehensive as the American order, but collectively, they are sufficient to reduce dependency for a critical mass of actors. You cannot recover hegemony by outcompeting a single rival when the challenge is not a rival, but an exit option. An exit option, once built and demonstrated to function, does not disappear simply because the hegemon improves its behavior. American power without American legitimacy is not hegemony. It is just a very large country with a very large military, and history suggests that is a considerably more volatile thing to have at the center of the international system. Hegemonic transitions are the most dangerous moments in the history of the international system. When Dutch hegemony gave way to British leadership in the 18th century, the transition ran through decades of maritime conflict. When British hegemony gave way to American leadership in the 20th century, it ran through 2 world wars and a global depression. The scholars who studied these transitions, from Robert Gilpin to Graham Allison, agree on this fundamental point. The period between the erosion of one hegemonic order and the consolidation of another is the period of maximum systemic instability. Not because the powers involved necessarily want conflict, but because the rules of the old order have dissolved before the rules of the new order have been written. And in that gap, miscalculations happen. We are in that gap right now. 3 broad scenarios define the possibility space for this transition. Manage multipolarity, in which the United States genuinely accepts that the unipolar moment is over and pivots to shaping the terms of the multipolar order, replacing it through reduced dollar weaponization, genuine institutional reform, and negotiated great power coexistence is the most stable outcome, and the least likely, requiring a domestic political consensus that does not currently exist. Accepting relative decline, even managed and strategically shaped decline, is extraordinarily difficult for any democracy to sustain across electoral cycles. Competitive fragmentation, the default trajectory in which the system fractures into a dollar zone, a yuan zone, and a large contested middle ground of swing states practicing transactional diplomacy with both poles, is the most probable near-term reality. This middle ground is where the most consequential geopolitics of the next decade will be played out, and it is more dangerous than it initially appears. Swing states that refuse alignment reduce the predictability of the system, creating ambiguity about commitments that in periods of crisis can be fatally misread. Hegemonic reassertion, in which Washington mobilizes genuine political will to rebuild its credibility architecture through sustained policy change and demonstrated restraint, cannot be dismissed, but has no historical precedent at the scale of erosion already experienced. The bar is not just high, it is historically unprecedented. 5 governments will most powerfully shape which scenario unfolds. Saudi Arabia's oil pricing decisions will determine whether the petrodollar system survives in its current form or begins a managed decline that reshapes global capital flows. India's alignment choices will determine whether the swing state middle ground becomes a stabilizing third force or a source of perpetual systemic ambiguity. Germany's decisions about European strategic autonomy will determine whether the transatlantic relationship evolves into a genuine partnership or fractures under diverging interests. Brazil's positioning within BRICS will shape whether the Western Hemisphere remains a zone of American strategic primacy. And Indonesia, the world's 4th most populous country and the pivotal economy of Southeast Asia, will signal, through its alignment choices, whether the Indo-Pacific remains anchored to American security architecture or begins its own drift towards strategic neutrality. Every major hegemonic transition in modern history has included at least one catastrophic miscalculation. Not because the powers involved wanted war, but because the rules of the old order dissolved before the rules of the new were written. The most dangerous moment is not when the old power falls, it is the period before the new order is established. When the rules are unclear, the commitments are uncertain, and the miscalculations are most likely. We are in that period now. Return for a moment to the dollar, not to the statistics. Return to the question underneath all of it. The question every finance minister, every central bank governor, every head of government in the non-Western world is now privately asking with an urgency that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. What happens if Washington decides to use the dollar against us? That question is the most consequential geopolitical fact of our present moment. Not because of what it says about the dollar, but because of what it says about trust. The trust that made the post-1945 American order function. The trust that American power, however self-interested, would operate within a framework of rules stable enough to plan around, reliable enough to build institutions on, predictable enough to make the cost of participation in the American system lower than the cost of exit, has crossed a threshold. Enough actors in the international system have independently concluded that the risk of unconditional dependence on American-controlled infrastructure outweighs the cost of building alternatives. And once that threshold is crossed at an institutional scale, the process it sets in motion does not reverse simply because the hegemon improves its behavior. The alternatives, once built, remain. The exit options, once demonstrated to function, do not disappear. The question, when seriously asked, does not return to unthinkable. American power is not collapsing. American hegemony is ending. And those are not the same thing. A powerful America that is no longer hegemonic is a frustrated America, still capable of enormous destructive and constructive force, still possessing tools of coercion without historical precedent, but operating in a world that no longer automatically defers to its leadership, no longer accepts its institutional frameworks as naturally legitimate, and no longer treats its rules as the default architecture of international life. That is a more dangerous configuration than either continued hegemony or a clean transition to a new order. It is a configuration most likely to produce the miscalculations that hegemonic transitions historically generate. The world is not turning away from America because it found something better. It is turning away because it found something safer. And that is the most precise and most honest measure of what American hegemony has become. Not a system the world actively wants to dismantle, but a system of dependency that enough of the world has concluded it can no longer afford to maintain without reservation. Washington still has agency in how this transition unfolds. The choices made in the next 5 years about the use of financial coercion, about genuine institutional reform, about the terms on which American power is offered to the world, will determine whether the United States shapes the order that replaces its hegemony or becomes the last major power to understand what it has already lost. That question has no answer yet, but the window in which it can still be answered on American terms is narrowing, and the rest of the world is not waiting for Washington to decide.